Chapter 1. The Forbidden Wish. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting a pale glow over the darkened desert. In the heart of the arid wasteland, a forgotten oasis sat, its waters still and uninviting. But beneath its calm surface, something far more dangerous slumbered. Hidden from the world for centuries, a Djinn waited, trapped in the ancient gilded lamp that had long since been buried beneath the sands. No one knew of the power contained within the lamp, or the dark figure that awaited release. Until one night, a young man, desperate and foolish, stumbled upon it. His name was Malek. He had heard whispers of the legend, the tales told in hushed voices by the elders of his village. The Djinn, they said, was a being of unimaginable beauty and power, bound by a curse to grant the wishes of those who dared to awaken her. But in return, the Djinn demanded a price too steep for most to pay. Yet Malek, driven by a deep yearning for wealth and influence, believed he could outsmart the curse. He found the lamp buried beneath the roots of a forgotten tree, its surface tarnished with age, but still shimmering with an undeniable allure. Without hesitation, he rubbed the lamp, the action done with the naive confidence of youth. The ground trembled beneath him as the air thickened, swirling with an energy he couldn't comprehend. The smoke began to rise. At first, it was a faint mist, curling and twisting into strange shapes. But soon it thickened, and from it emerged the Djinn. She stood tall and radiant, her violet skin shimmering in the moonlight. Her dark, flowing hair moved as if alive, and her piercing eyes glowed with an intense, unsettling blue. Her body was a vision of strength and beauty, adorned in flowing dark robes that shifted with the wind as if the fabric itself were alive. Malek gasped as he beheld her, both terrified and captivated by the creature standing before him. He had expected something powerful, but he had not prepared for this. For the first time, he felt a deep, primal fear, an instinct that told him to run, to flee from the supernatural force that stood before him. But he couldn't move. He was frozen in place, mesmerized by her gaze. "You have summoned me, mortal," the Djinn spoke, her voice like the whisper of the wind, soft yet commanding. "What is it that you seek?" Malek swallowed hard, his heart racing in his chest. He had heard of the Djinn's bargains, the twisted deals she made with men who were foolish enough to call upon her. He had been warned of her beauty, of how she could tempt the soul and bend the strongest wills. But none of the stories had prepared him for the overwhelming presence of this being. I want wealth," Malek stammered, his voice shaking with both desire and fear. "I want power. I want the world to bow at my feet." The Djinn's lips curved into a subtle smile, and her eyes glittered with amusement. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper now. "No," Malek said, emboldened by the certainty of his desires. "I want more than that. I want to rule, to have everything I've ever dreamed of. But I also want a woman by my side, someone beautiful, someone perfect." Her eyes gleamed as she stepped closer to him, her presence overpowering. "A beautiful woman," she murmured, as if tasting the words on her tongue. "And what would you be willing to pay, mortal, for such desires?" Malek hesitated, his mind racing. He knew the price would be steep, but the lure of power and beauty was too strong to resist. "Anything," he said, his voice filled with desperate certainty. "Anything to have it all." The Djinn's smile widened, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "Very well," she said. "You shall have your wealth, your power, and the woman you desire, but in return you must do something for me." Malik's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what she meant, but the promise of what she offered blinded him to any lingering doubts. "What must I do?" he asked, eager to seal the deal. The Djinn's eyes glinted, dark and knowing. "You must release me. Free me from this lamp, and I shall grant you everything you desire. But beware. Once you release me, there will be no turning back. You will belong to me, as will the woman I give you. Your soul will be mine to command." Malik felt a cold shiver run down his spine, but the thought of the power and beauty she promised overwhelmed his hesitation. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm, though his heart raced with uncertainty. With a sharp, sudden motion, the Djinn raised her hand, and the lamp in Malik's possession began to glow. The air grew thick with magic, and a voice echoed in Malik's mind, silent but deafening in its power. "Then prepare yourself, mortal, for what you have asked for." In an instant, the world around him shifted, the landscape blurred, and Malik's body was filled with an unnatural energy as the Djinn's power surged through him, binding him to her. And then, before he could react, she vanished, leaving him standing in the midst of a whirlwind of smoke and light. When the dust settled, a beautiful woman appeared before him, a woman who seemed to be everything he had ever wanted. She was flawless, her beauty beyond compare. Her dark, glossy hair cascaded around her shoulders, and her eyes shimmered with an unearthly allure. She was the embodiment of his desires, and in that moment, Malik realized the true cost of his bargain. The Djinn had kept her word. She had given him everything he had wished for, but now he was bound to her forever. Chapter 2. The Temptation Unleashed. Malik could feel the weight of his decision settling in, but the allure of the woman before him kept his thoughts clouded. She was exactly what he had imagined, perfect, ethereal, an otherworldly beauty that seemed to belong not to the earth, but to the heavens themselves. Her eyes glowed with an almost hypnotic intensity, and every movement she made was graceful and deliberate. She was everything he had desired, and more. "She is yours," the Djinn's voice echoed in his mind, smooth and seductive. "But she is not a gift without a price. To claim her, you must first fulfill your end of the bargain." Malik tried to shake off the unease building in his chest. The Djinn had spoken the truth. He had everything he wanted, but something about the situation didn't sit right. The woman before him was both beautiful and unsettling, as though her presence was too perfect, too precise. But he couldn't deny the rush of power that surged through his veins. The woman, whose beauty surpassed any mortal woman, took a step closer to Malik. Her voice was like velvet, smooth and sweet. "I am here to fulfill your desires, Malik," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I will be by your side, as you wished, but you must remember, nothing is truly free." Malik swallowed hard, his mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded in the desert. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. She tilted her head slightly, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I am bound to you, just as you are bound to me. My power flows through you, and in exchange you will do as I command. But do not think that this comes without its price. There is always a price for the power you seek." Despite the heaviness in her words, Malik's mind was clouded by the intoxicating beauty of the woman standing before him. He felt stronger, more alive. and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the right choice. His thoughts swirled with fantasies of power, of ruling over kingdoms, with this woman by his side. She reached out to him, her fingers lightly brushing against his arm, and he felt an electric current surge through his body. His heart raced as his eyes met hers. Her touch was delicate, but there was a sense of dominance in the way she moved, as though she knew that with just a touch she could make him forget everything he had once known. "You will have everything you desire, Malik," she whispered, her voice like honey. "But the question is, what will you do to keep it?" He looked into her eyes, and for a moment he saw something flicker, something dark and dangerous. His breath caught in his throat, and a shiver ran down his spine. The air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if the temperature itself was reacting to the dark power emanating from the woman before him. "Anything," Malik said, his voice filled with a quiet, obsessive certainty. "I will do whatever it takes." She smiled again, but this time it wasn't the sweet, reassuring smile of a lover. It was something darker, something that hinted at the price he would have to pay. "Good," she replied softly, almost in a murmur, "because the moment you called me into your world, your fate was sealed." The realization hit Malik with an unsettling force. It was too late to turn back now, and the Djinn knew it. She held his fate in her hands, and the promise of power came with an invisible chain that bound him to her. As the days passed, Malik's life began to change in ways he couldn't have imagined. The woman, whose name he learned was Sela, never left his side. Everywhere he went, she was there, her beauty and allure impossible to ignore. But the more he grew accustomed to her presence, the more he realized that something wasn't right. Sela never seemed to age. Her beauty remained untouched by time, and her eyes, those piercing, glowing eyes, seemed to look right through him. The power that Malik had gained came easily, and soon his influence stretched far and wide. Wealth poured in, and enemies were destroyed by his command. Yet, with each passing victory, a growing sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. The more he had, the more he wanted, and the more he wanted, the more he began to realize that Sela was not just a beautiful woman by his side. She was something far more sinister. She was not only his companion, she was his captor, and he was her puppet. One evening, as Malik sat in his grand hall, surrounded by the spoils of his newfound power, he asked Sela a question that had been weighing on his mind. "What is your true nature, Sela? What are you really?" Sela stood by the window, looking out over the city, her dark robes flowing around her like a shadow. Her eyes never left the horizon, but she spoke in a voice so calm, so deliberate, that it sent a chill through Malik's spine. "I am what you made me," she said, her voice steady. "I am the price you paid. I am the darkness that follows every wish, the shadow behind every dream of power." Her words were like a warning, but Malik refused to hear it. He couldn't. He was too far gone, too consumed by the lust for power to care about the consequences. He had everything he wanted, and with Sela by his side, nothing would stop him from taking even more. But deep down, a nagging doubt gnawed at him. The price was coming, and he would pay it, whether he was ready or not. Chapter 3. The price of power days turned into weeks, and Malik's empire continued to grow under his newfound influence. He had everything he could have ever dreamed of: gold, power, and the unwavering companionship of Sela, the woman who had brought him into a world beyond his wildest imagination. But as the days passed, the weight of his choices began to settle upon him like an oppressive storm cloud. Selah was always by his side, her beauty never faltering, her presence always commanding. But it was no longer just her beauty that consumed him. It was her silence, the dark aura that seemed to cling to her like a shroud. She never spoke much about herself, only about the desires she could grant him, the power she could help him seize. She had given him everything, but the price was growing clearer with each passing day. Malik began to notice things, small things at first. His reflection in the mirror seemed to flicker, distorted by an unseen force. His once bright eyes began to darken, his skin paler than it had been before he summoned the Djinn. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept peacefully, his nights haunted by strange dreams of fire and darkness. And all the while, Sila remained an enigma, an untouchable figure whose beauty only seemed to grow, while he felt more and more like a hollow shell of the man he had once been. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and purple, Malik sat alone in his private chambers. His thoughts were troubled, the weight of his decisions crushing him. He had everything, yet he felt more empty than ever. The laughter of courtiers and the cries of slaves, the endless flow of riches, all seemed distant, meaningless. Sila entered the room silently, her dark robe trailing behind her like a shadow. She closed the door behind her, and Malik didn't have to look up to know she was there. He could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on him. "You look troubled." Sila's voice cut through the silence, smooth as silk, but with an underlying edge that sent a shiver down his spine. "Have you begun to understand the cost of what you have taken from me?" Malik raised his eyes to meet hers, but instead of the burning desire he had once felt, there was only emptiness. The power that had once consumed him now felt like a burden, and the woman before him, though still beautiful, had become an eerie reminder of his own lost humanity. "I don't know if I understand," he admitted, his voice thick with frustration. "I thought I wanted all this. I thought power would make me happy. But I feel like I've lost something important." Scylla tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've lost much, Malik," she said softly. "But you've also gained everything you wanted. Power, wealth, influence. But nothing comes without sacrifice. And for everything you've gained, something must be given in return." Malik stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the stone floor. "What have I given?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What price have I paid?" "You've given me everything I've ever wanted." Sila's expression darkened, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "The price isn't always obvious," she replied, her voice low and dangerous. "It's not always something you can see right away. But rest assured, Malik, the price is coming, and when it does, you will wish you had never made the wish in the first place." He took a step back, his heart racing. The atmosphere in the room had changed, the air thick with an almost tangible energy. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sela's eyes flickered with something darker, something ancient. "You are bound to me, just as I am bound to you. But you must know, Malik, that I do not give my gifts freely. I take what is owed to me, and in the end, it will always come due." A sharp chill ran through his body, and for the first time, he felt truly afraid of her. "I don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "You will," Selah replied softly, "but by then it will be too late." Her words haunted him long after she had left the room. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a path from which there would be no return. The riches, the women, the power, all of it seemed meaningless now, as if he had traded his soul for a fleeting moment of glory. As the days went on, Malik's mind began to unravel. He found it harder to sleep, and when he did, he was plagued by nightmares of fires that burned through cities, of screams that echoed through his mind. He could hear Selah's voice in his dreams, whispering of the cost, of the price he had yet to pay. One night, in a fit of rage and frustration, Malik stormed into the heart of his palace, demanding answers from the Djinn. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the empty air. "I've given you everything. Why do you torment me?" The room was still, but then, as if conjured from the very shadows, Selah appeared before him. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly fire, and her smile was cold, detached. "I torment you because you are mine," she said softly, her voice low and dangerous. "I am the price you've paid, Malik, and I will never let you forget it." Malik's chest tightened, his heart pounding in his ears. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He had been consumed by his greed, and now the price of his desires was closing in on him. "I'm not free," he whispered, his voice breaking. Selah's smile grew wider, and her eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. "No, Malik," she said, her voice like a cold wind. "You never were." And so, Malik realized too late that the power he had sought so desperately had come at a cost far greater than he had ever imagined. The price was not just his soul, it was his very humanity, and there would be no escape. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. The days dragged on, heavy and oppressive. Malik's empire continued to grow in wealth and influence, yet he felt increasingly detached from it all. His nights were haunted by the nightmares that had begun to blur the line between dream and reality. The power that had once been intoxicating now felt like a weight around his neck, choking the very life out of him. Selah, ever present by his side, was both his savior and his tormentor. She was everything he had desired and more, beautiful, powerful, and cold. But now, with every passing moment, Malik began to sense the truth beneath her flawless exterior. She wasn't just a woman, she was a force, a dark presence that seemed to consume everything around her. And he had brought her into his life, bound himself to her in ways he couldn't undo. One evening, as the sun set behind the walls of his palace, Malik stood at the edge of his balcony, looking down at the bustling city below. The streets were filled with people, unaware of the storm brewing in the heart of their ruler. He could feel the weight of their eyes upon him, but it was the weight of his own guilt that pressed hardest on his chest. "Are you watching, Malik?" Selah's voice cut through the silence, as cold and seductive as ever. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling glow. "Do you see what you've built? Do you feel the power coursing through you?" Malik didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The question was rhetorical, meant only to remind him of the truth he could no longer escape. "I feel it," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "But it's not enough anymore. It never was." Selah stepped forward, her presence as commanding as ever. "You wanted power," she said, her voice soft but dangerous. "You wanted wealth. You wanted to rule. And you have it all. But you still feel empty, don't you?" Malik's jaw clenched. She was right. Despite everything he had gained, he felt more isolated than ever. The power he had dreamed of was now his prison, and it had taken everything from him, his peace, his happiness, and soon his soul. Sila's smile curled into something almost mocking, as if she knew exactly what was running through his mind. You see, Malik, the price has been paid, and now you must reap what you have sown. The words sent a chill through his body. He had thought he could control the consequences, that he could tame the powers Selah offered him. But now it was clear that he was the one being controlled. "Is this what you wanted from the beginning?" Malik asked, his voice breaking. "To break me, to turn me into nothing?" Sila's eyes narrowed, a dark fire flickering in their depths. "I didn't do this to you, Malik," she replied, her tone eerily calm. As the two of them stood facing each other, the fate of their conflict hung in the balance. The price of Malik's choices had already been steep, but the final cost was yet to be paid. And as the dark energy swirled around them, Malik knew that this battle would determine everything. The game was far from over. Chapter 5. The Final Reckoning. The air crackled with tension as Malik and Selah stood face to face, the weight of their battle heavy in the room. Malik's body still trembled from the shock of his own rebellion, his will now a force he hadn't known he possessed. Selah, however, seemed unfazed, her dark eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity, as if the chaos swirling around them only fueled her power. "You're foolish to think you can resist me, Malik," she hissed, her voice cold as ice, every word dripping with disdain. Her form shimmered, the shadows around her darkening as she began to draw upon the very forces that bound them together. Malik's pulse raced, his breath shallow. But deep within him, something had shifted. For the first time since he had summoned Selah, he understood the true cost of his choices, not just in wealth or power, but in his very soul. He had traded pieces of himself for fleeting desires, and now those pieces were coming back to claim their toll. "You won't control me any more," Malik declared, his voice steady, a new conviction burning in his chest. "You're nothing more than a shadow now, and I will burn it away." Silah's lips curled into a smile that was more like a sneer. "You think you have the power to stop me? You are weak, Malik. You are nothing without me." Malik's hand tightened into a fist, the power within him rising, fueled by the desperation that now gripped his heart. He felt his connection to Selah like a tether, but unlike before, it no longer felt like a chain around his neck. It felt like a rope that he could cut through with his own strength. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Selah. "You gave me everything I wanted," he said, his voice low, yet filled with defiance. "But I'm done being your puppet. I'll destroy everything you've built." Silah's expression twisted into something more dangerous, something darker. "You think you can destroy me? You think you can escape this?" She lifted her arms, and the shadows around her began to writhe, swirling like a storm. "I am not just a woman, Malik. I am the price you've paid. I am your doom, your punishment, and your reward, and you cannot escape me." The room seemed to shake with the force of her words. Malik could feel the weight of her power bearing down on him, but it only made him fight harder. He couldn't let her win. He had seen the darkness she had brought into his life, the way she had poisoned every part of his soul, and he couldn't allow it to continue. With a burst of strength, Malik summoned all the energy he had left. focusing it on the bond that tethered him to Scylla. The shadows swirled around him, trying to suffocate him, but he fought through them. His mind was clear now. He understood the key to breaking the curse she had placed on him. It wasn't power, it wasn't wealth, it was sacrifice. "I will set you free," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm around him, "and I'll pay whatever price I must." Scylla's eyes widened in fury. "No!" she screamed, her form flickering with an intensity that threatened to engulf the room. "You cannot. You are mine." But Malik was already moving. With every ounce of strength he had left, he reached into the very core of their connection, severing it. The room trembled violently, and the shadows seemed to scream in agony as they began to dissipate. Malik's heart pounded, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to destroy the darkness she had wrapped around him. Scylla's form wavered, as if she were struggling to maintain her shape. Her voice was shrill, desperate now. "You fool! You cannot destroy me. I will consume you. I will—" But before she could finish, a brilliant light exploded from Malik's chest, engulfing the room in a blinding glow. It was as if every ounce of darkness, every shred of corruption, was being torn away in a single, violent burst. Malik felt the power surge through him, and for a moment he feared he might be consumed by it. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light began to fade. The shadows receded, and the oppressive weight that had hung over him for so long lifted. When the light finally dimmed, Malik opened his eyes. The room was silent, still, and Scylla was gone. For a long moment, Malik stood there, his chest heaving, the remnants of the dark power still pulsing in his veins. He had done it. He had freed himself. But the cost was still there, lingering in the air. He had lost so much, and he could feel the emptiness gnawing at him once more. But he had won. He had broken free from the chains that had bound him for so long. Malik collapsed to his knees, exhaustion flooding his body. The room, once dark and oppressive, now felt strangely peaceful. The weight of his decision still hung over him, but now there was a flicker of hope that maybe he could rebuild. Maybe he could find redemption. The darkness had been vanquished, but the journey to reclaim his soul was just beginning. And in that silence, he understood one final truth. There was no power greater than the freedom to choose.